The most dangerous moment in an Ice Age night was not necessarily midnight. It may have come much later, when dawn felt close. The sleepers were most exhausted, the air was often near its coldest, and the last pieces of fuel had already been trusted to survive until morning. That was the paradox. The nearer daylight came, the easier it was to believe the danger had passed. But when the final ember went dark before sunrise, what happened inside the shelter next? Long before the sky began to pale, the cold had already been working through the shelter for hours. It did not arrive all at once. It moved slowly through stone, soil, air, and every surface that had lost the warmth of the previous day. Outside, the landscape might have been open steppe, a frozen valley, or the entrance to a cave facing a winter wind. Inside, the group would not have experienced the night as a single temperature. The space nearest the fire was warmer. The floor remained cold. The edges of the shelter, where moving air could enter, were colder still. Even a shallow draft passing beneath a hide screen or around a rock wall could carry away warmth from exposed skin and from clothing that was thin, damp, or badly arranged. Archaeology cannot tell us the exact weather of one forgotten night, or the exact shape of every shelter used during the Ice Age. It can tell us that people repeatedly occupied caves, rock shelters, and open-air camps, and that hearths often became important centers within those living spaces. The fire in this shelter was still burning, but the cold around it had never stopped. A flame did not turn the whole interior into a warm room. Its heat weakened with distance, and the people lying farthest from it would have received less. Stone walls might block part of the wind, yet they could also remain cold to the touch. Bare ground drew heat from any body resting directly upon it. For that reason, plant material, hides, and other forms of bedding mattered. They were not soft decorations. They helped separate the body from a surface that could continue taking warmth throughout the night. The danger before dawn began here, not with a sudden disaster, but with a long balance between heat produced by human bodies, heat given by the fire, and heat continuously lost to the surroundings. Wind made that balance more difficult. Air moving across the entrance could replace a layer of slightly warmed air with colder air from outside. Smoke had to escape, so a shelter could not simply be sealed without consequence. An opening that reduced smoke might also admit cold. A screen that blocked wind could shift, loosen, or leave gaps. The most protected place might be close to a wall, yet that wall could be chilled. The warmest place might be close to the hearth, yet it could also be smoky or too hot for safe sleep. The group had to live within these compromises. They did not need to understand heat transfer in modern terms to recognize them. Experience would have shown which side of the hearth was warmer, where wind entered, which ground stayed damp, and where a sleeping body cooled too quickly. During many clear nights, surface temperatures continue falling until near sunrise because the ground loses heat for hours without receiving energy from the sun. Conditions varied greatly, but this helps explain why the last part of a winter night could feel harsher than the first. By then, the people had been still for a long time, movement had decreased, muscles were producing less heat than during the day. Any moisture held in hides, footwear, hair, or bedding had had hours to become cold. The fire was still present, giving light, warming the nearest air, and sending brief pulses of heat across the shelter. Yet, the group's safety did not rest on flame alone. It depended on position, insulation, distance from the ground, shelter from moving air, and the shared warmth of nearby bodies. Before the fire went out, the night had already tested every one of these protections. The final hours before dawn were therefore not an empty waiting period. They were the point at which small weaknesses had had the longest time to matter, while the people inside remained asleep and the fuel beside them continued to burn down. The people inside the shelter did not all receive the same protection from the night. Their position mattered. A person lying nearest the hearth would feel more radiant heat, but that place also carried risks. Sparks could fall onto dry grass or hides. Smoke might drift low if the air stopped moving well. Too much heat could force someone to shift away, while a change in wind could suddenly send smoke toward the sleeping group. Farther from the fire, the air was cooler, but breathing might be easier. Along the walls, stone could block direct wind, yet the surface itself remained cold. Near the entrance, fresh air reduced smoke, but exposed the body to drafts. Every sleeping place was a compromise, and those compromises became more important as the fire weakened through the night. People could reduce heat loss by arranging themselves close together. Shared body warmth did not replace the fire, but it reduced the amount of exposed surface around each person. Children, older adults, or anyone already weakened by injury or hunger may have been placed nearer the warmer center of the group, although archaeology cannot show the exact sleeping order of one camp. What can be said with greater confidence is that group sleeping, layered coverings, and insulated resting places would all have helped in cold conditions. Hides could trap still air close to the body. Dry grasses, reeds, leaves, moss, or other plant material could separate sleepers from the ground. The value of such bedding came not from softness alone, but from slowing the transfer of body heat into cold soil or stone. A hide laid directly on frozen ground would offer less protection than a thicker layer built from several materials. If moisture entered the bedding, its performance would decline. Damp plant fibers compressed under weight, and wet hides could become heavy and cold. This meant that the work of staying warm began long before anyone lay down. Materials had to be gathered, dried, carried, and placed where they would not immediately absorb water from the floor. In a cave, the deepest area was not always the best place to sleep. Some inner spaces trapped smoke or offered poor ventilation. Some entrances allowed more light and easier escape but admitted wind. Under a rock shelter, the overhang could protect against snow or rain while leaving one or more sides open to cold air. At open-air camps, windbreaks made from hides, branches, bones, or available vegetation could reduce exposure, but they could not remove it completely. The hearth therefore worked together with the shelter rather than replacing it. Its warmth was shaped by walls, openings, the height of the roof, the direction of the wind, and the arrangement of bodies around it. Even the direction a person faced could matter. The side turned toward the fire received more heat, while the other side cooled. A sleeper might wake and turn without fully understanding why. Someone at the edge of the group might pull a hide closer. Another person might move a child inward. These small adjustments would not necessarily become memorable events. They were ordinary responses, learned through repeated nights. Yet they also reveal why the final hours before dawn were fragile. The sleeping group was not simply surrounded by warmth. It was maintaining a narrow zone of protection through distance, insulation, shelter, and cooperation. As the fuel burned lower, that zone became smaller. The people closest to the hearth might still feel comfortable, while those near the outer edge began losing warmth more quickly. Nothing dramatic had happened. No one needed to be awake. The arrangement still appeared to work. A small reserve of fuel might lie within reach, but placing it too close risked sparks, while placing it farther away required someone to leave the warmest area. Every layer of protection depended on the fire, continuing to contribute at least some heat until morning. By the last part of the night, the fire had already consumed most of what had been prepared for it. A pile that looked sufficient at sunset could appear surprisingly small after hours of steady burning. Thick pieces of wood lasted longer, but they were harder to gather, carry, dry, and place safely. Thin branches caught quickly but disappeared quickly as well. In some regions and seasons, people may also have burned bone, grasses, shrubs, or other available materials, yet every fuel had limits. Moisture reduced heat and produced more smoke. Frozen wood could warm slowly before burning well. Green branches might smolder without giving the same steady flame as dry fuel. The people who had prepared the hearth would have known many of these differences through experience, but experience could not make fuel endless. It only helped them judge how much might be needed, and that judgment was always shaped by weather, travel, exhaustion, and what the surrounding landscape could provide. A group arriving late at a shelter might have had less time to collect fuel. Snow could cover fallen branches. Rain from earlier days could leave wood damp beneath the surface. In open country, usable fuel might have been scattered far from the sleeping place. Every armful carried into camp represented time and effort taken from other tasks before darkness. By the hours before dawn, those earlier decisions had become visible in the shrinking distance between the final pieces of fuel and the fire. No one inside the shelter needed to make a serious mistake for the reserve to become dangerously low. The night might simply be colder than expected, the wind stronger, or the wood less dry than it appeared. Meanwhile, the people around the hearth were not beginning the night with fresh bodies. They had already spent the day walking, gathering, hunting, cutting, carrying, repairing, watching children, preparing food, and protecting their place of rest. Cold itself increased the effort required for many of these tasks. Heavy hides restricted movement. Frozen ground made travel more difficult. Hunger or minor injury could deepen fatigue. When people finally slept, the body's need for rest competed with the need to notice changes in the fire. A designated watcher is possible in some situations, but archaeology cannot tell us that every group maintained a formal watch-through every night. Even when someone intended to remain alert, tiredness could narrow attention. A person might wake briefly, see a red glow beneath the wood, and believe that it would last. Another might hear a branch settle and assume that someone else would respond. The group's familiarity with the hearth could make its presence feel stable, even though a fire is never truly stable. It depends on fuel, oxygen, dryness, and repeated small interventions. Near dawn, the darkness could also become misleading. The eastern sky might begin to change long before direct sunlight reached the shelter. Snow, cloud, or pale stone could reflect faint light and create the impression that morning was closer than it really was. A sleeper opening their eyes for only a moment might see less darkness than before and decide there was no need to rise. The coldest part of the night was not identical in every location or weather pattern, but in many conditions, temperatures continued to fall through the long hours without sunlight. The group could therefore feel that danger was ending at the very time their fuel reserve was weakest and their bodies were most reluctant to move. The fire was still present. A few pieces of wood remained. Red embers still held heat beneath a soft layer of ash. Nothing had yet failed, but the shelter now depended on a much smaller margin than it had at sunset. The distance between a living hearth and a cold one might be only one unattended interval, one damp branch, or one decision to wait until the sky grew lighter. A small Ice Age hearth did not warm an entire shelter in the way a modern heated room does. Its warmth was strongest close to the flames and weakened quickly with distance. Much of what people felt near the fire came from radiant heat moving directly from the burning fuel toward the body. That heat could warm exposed skin, clothing, hides, tools, and the surface of nearby stone. But it did not spread evenly through every part of a cave, rock shelter, or open camp. Air warmed above the fire tended to rise. In a high cave, much of that warmer air could move upward and away from the people lying on the ground. In an open shelter, wind could carry it out almost as soon as it formed. Even when the air near the hearth became warmer, the floor could remain cold, the rear wall could remain cold, and the entrance could continue admitting colder air from outside. The result was not one shared temperature, but several small zones. A person close to the hearth might feel heat on the front of the body, while the back remained cool. Someone, only a short distance farther away, might feel almost none of that direct warmth. A child lying between adults could be protected by both body heat and the fire, while a person near the edge of the sleeping group could lose warmth much faster. These differences mattered because the fire's value before dawn depended not only on whether it was still visible, but on how much heat it was actually delivering to each part of the shelter. A low fire could continue glowing while already failing to support those farthest away. Archaeological hearths vary greatly in size, shape, and use, so there was no single Ice Age fire that served every purpose. Some hearths were small and carefully placed. Others were larger or reused many times. A fire used for cooking might not have been arranged in the same way as one intended, mainly for warmth. Fuel choice also affected the heat. Fast-burning brush produced quick flames but little endurance. Dense wood could last longer. Bone could burn under certain conditions, especially when it contained fat, but it did not behave like dry firewood. Damp fuel might create smoke and weak heat. The people around the hearth would have learned these differences from repeated use, yet they still had to work within the limits of what the landscape provided. The central problem of the night remained the same. The fire had to maintain a useful zone of warmth until daylight returned. That zone could shrink long before the final ember disappeared. As flames lowered, radiant heat weakened. Areas once comfortable became cool. Sleepers might move closer without fully waking, reducing the open space around the hearth and increasing the danger from sparks. Hides might be drawn inward. A person responsible for adding fuel might delay because the fire still looked alive. This visual survival of the flame could be misleading. A fire could remain bright enough to see while no longer producing enough heat for the outer sleepers. It could also appear weak but preserve a deep bed of hot embers capable of being revived. What mattered was not appearance alone, but stored heat, fuel, airflow, and distance. Before dawn, when the reserve of wood was smallest, the group's protection depended on understanding those limits. The hearth was not a wall against winter. It was a temporary center of heat that had to be continually fed, positioned, and shared. Nearby stone could absorb some heat and release it slowly, but this effect was local and depended on the material, distance, and duration of burning. It could soften the cooling for a time, not preserve the whole shelter. If that center contracted too far, the cold began reclaiming the shelter even before the fire itself went out. The fire at the center of an Ice Age shelter was doing more than warming the people nearest to it. Its heat also acted upon the materials on which the next hours depended. Hides placed close enough to receive warmth, but not close enough to scorch, could lose moisture gathered from snow, rain, damp ground, breath, and the bodies wrapped inside them. Plant bedding could be turned or spread where rising warmth might help it dry. Foot coverings, cords, wooden shafts, and clothing made from animal skin could be kept away from the wettest parts of the floor. Archaeology cannot usually show that a particular hide was deliberately hung beside a particular hearth on a particular night. Organic materials rarely survive well, and many traces of daily use disappear. Yet the physical value of drying was simple and immediate. Moist material conducted heat away from the body more readily than dry, air-filled layers, and it could become stiff in freezing conditions. Keeping coverings and bedding usable was therefore part of keeping the sleeping group warm. The fire also changed food. Meat could be roasted, fat could soften, frozen portions could become easier to cut, and some plant foods could be heated before eating. Burned bone, charred plant remains, heated stones, ash, and altered sediments show that Paleolithic hearths were repeatedly connected with food preparation, although the exact use of every fire cannot be reconstructed. Cooking did not make all food safe, nor did every meal require it, but heat could soften tissues, change flavor, and make certain foods easier to chew and digest. A hearth active into the night could preserve a warm portion of food for someone returning late, allow a frozen piece to thaw gradually, or support the final preparation of what would be eaten before sleep. These were small benefits, but before dawn they became part of the same narrow system of protection as the warmth reaching the sleepers. If the fire weakened, it was not only the air around the group that began to cool. Damp hides stopped drying. Frozen food remained hard. Materials placed near the hearth no longer received enough heat to change. Around the light, people could also continue tasks that would have been difficult in complete darkness. Stone edges might be inspected, a wooden point adjusted, sinew or cord checked, a hide scraped, or fuel rearranged for the remaining hours. We cannot know which tasks were performed at every camp, and the distribution of artifacts around hearths does not provide a perfect record of individual actions. People moved objects, cleaned spaces, reused fires, and returned to the same shelters many times. Even so, hearths often formed important centers around which work, food, and rest were organized. Their light was limited and unsteady, but it allowed hands and faces to remain visible within a small circle. That circle mattered, especially during an Ice Age night, because useful objects had to be found without exposing the group to the cold outside. A cutting tool left beyond the light, a bundle of dry grass placed too far from the hearth, or a reserve of fuel hidden in shadow could be harder to reach when everyone was tired. Firelight helped maintain order within the shelter, showing where people lay, where sparks had fallen, and whether smoke was drifting toward the sleeping area. It also made the condition of the fire itself easier to judge. Flame height, the color of embers, the settling of ash, and the position of unburned fuel could all be watched while other work continued. None of these functions required a large blaze. A modest hearth could provide enough light and localized heat to support them, but each depended on continuity. As the flames became lower before dawn, drying slowed, work ended, food cooled, and the visible circle contracted. The fire had not yet gone out, but more of the shelter was already returning to darkness and cold. The light of an Ice Age hearth did not push the night away very far. Beyond the nearest bodies, tools, hides, and stones, darkness returned quickly. Within that small illuminated area, however, people could see one another, notice movement, locate fuel, and judge whether smoke was rising cleanly or drifting low across the shelter. This made the hearth more than a source of heat. It became a point around which space could be organized. Sleeping places, work areas, food, dry materials, waste, and dangerous objects such as sharp stone tools could be kept in positions that were easier to remember and reach. In a cave or rock shelter, the placement of the fire affected how much of the interior remained visible and how smoke moved toward the entrance or roof. A hearth, set too deep inside, could fill the occupied space with smoke. One placed too close to an exposed opening could lose heat to the wind or throw sparks toward dry material. The best position depended on the shape of the shelter, the direction of airflow, the fuel being burned, and the activities taking place around it. Archaeological patterns can sometimes show repeated hearth locations and concentrations of artifacts, but they do not preserve every reason behind those choices. Even so, a fire that was carefully positioned could help create a zone in which people understood where warmth, light, and useful objects were most likely to be found. Smoke was part of that zone as well. In small amounts and with good ventilation, it rose away from the sleepers and left a recognizable smell around the camp. It may also have discouraged some insects and animals from approaching closely, but smoke was not a perfect barrier, and its effects varied with wind, fuel, and species. Thick smoke could become a danger to the people themselves. It irritated eyes, made breathing difficult, darkened surfaces, and could force sleepers to move. A change in wind could carry it into the resting area without warning. For this reason, maintaining a fire meant managing both its benefits and its discomforts. The group could not simply make the largest possible blaze and assume that greater flames always meant greater safety. A fire that was too large consumed fuel rapidly, increased the risk of burns, and produced more smoke. A fire that was too small might preserve embers but provide little useful light or heat. The workable hearth lay between these extremes. Its circle of visibility allowed the group to detect a shifting hide screen, a rolling ember, a child moving too close to the flame, or an unfamiliar sound near the entrance. Yet light could not reveal everything outside the shelter. Darkness beyond the hearth remained deeper by contrast, and smoke or uneven stone could block the view. Fire may have influenced how some animals approached a human camp, but it did not make people untouchable. Hunger, curiosity, distance, numbers, wind direction, and previous experience all mattered. Nor did the presence of a flame remove the dangers already inside the shelter. Sparks could ignite bedding. Heated stones could burn skin. Smoke could accumulate. A poorly placed fire could divide the sleeping area or make movement difficult. The hearth therefore created a controlled center, not a sealed refuge. Before dawn, that distinction became increasingly important. As the flame lowered, the visible circle contracted. Objects near the edge disappeared into shadow. Smoke changed as the fire shifted from open flame towards smoldering fuel. The group still possessed a center of warmth and order, but that center was becoming smaller, quieter, and less reliable. Each small reduction in light, also reduced the time available to interpret a sound before deciding how to respond. Nothing outside had necessarily changed. The shelter had not suddenly opened. The people had not yet lost the fire, yet the boundary between what they could see and what they could only hear was already moving inward. A fire does not pass from life to death in a single visible moment. It changes through stages, and each stage can give a different impression to someone waking briefly in the dark. Open flame is the easiest to recognize. It moves, makes sound, throws light across the shelter, and gives a clear signal that fuel is still burning actively. Beneath that flame, however, lies a second form of fire that may be less dramatic but more important for survival through the final hours of night. Glowing embers contain heat after the taller flames have fallen. A thick piece of wood can appear dark on the outside while remaining hot within. Charcoal can preserve a red interior under a grey surface. If enough heat remains and dry material is added with air, a weak hearth can return to flame. This is why the absence of visible flame did not always mean the fire had been lost. People experienced with hearths would have known that a quiet bed of embers could be more useful than a brief, bright flame that consumed fuel too quickly. Yet embers were also harder to judge, especially for someone who was tired, cold, and only partly awake. A red glow might be visible from one angle and hidden from another. Ash could cover the hottest material. A piece of fuel might still shine along one edge, while its center had already cooled too far to ignite anything new. The layer of ash above a hearth added another source of uncertainty. Ash is not simply the dead remains of fire. When it forms over embers, it can slow the loss of heat and help protect them from moving air. A hearth that looked pale and quiet on the surface could still hold usable heat below. The same pale surface could also cover nothing more than cold charcoal and exhausted fuel. From a sleeping place several steps away, these two conditions might look almost identical. Light from a weak ember did not reach far. Smoke might continue for a time after flames disappeared. A faint smell of burning wood could remain in hides, hair, and stone even when the hearth itself had nearly failed. These lingering signs could persuade a tired person that the fire was safer than it really was. Sound could mislead as well. A settling branch might produce a crack or a small fall of sparks, then leave the hearth quieter than before. A person could hear that sound, assume fresh burning had begun, and return to sleep without checking the fuel beneath the ash. None of this required carelessness. It followed from the natural behavior of fire and the limits of human attention in darkness. Archaeological hearths preserve burned sediment, charcoal, ash, and heated stone, but they do not preserve the exact brightness of an ember or the judgment made by someone beside it. We can therefore describe the physical stages with confidence while remaining cautious about the precise actions of any one group. What matters for the hours before dawn is that a fire could appear to remain alive while its ability to recover was already shrinking. The visible flame might be gone, but deep embers could still survive, or the red surface might remain while the heat needed to ignite new fuel had nearly disappeared. Dry tinder, gentle airflow, and fuel of the right size could preserve the opportunity to rebuild it. Heavy damp wood placed too soon could smother what little heat remained. Too much air could scatter ash and accelerate cooling. Too little could leave the embers buried and fading. The difference between these states could be small, temporary, and hidden beneath ash. In that uncertainty, the hearth became most deceptive. It was neither clearly burning nor clearly dead. It occupied a narrow interval in which one careful intervention might restore it, while one more period of neglect could allow the last useful heat to escape. A hearth could weaken for reasons that were ordinary, gradual, and difficult to notice in time. One of the most important was moisture. Wood that looked dry on the surface could still hold water inside, especially after snow, rain, or long exposure to damp ground. Before such fuel burned well, part of the fire's heat had to be spent driving that moisture away. Frost on a branch could melt first, then soak the outer fibers before enough heat reached the drier wood beneath. This delayed ignition at the exact moment when the ember bed had little energy to spare. The result could be more smoke, less flame, and a slower rise in temperature. A branch might hiss, darken, and smolder without giving enough heat to ignite the next piece. If several damp pieces were added together, they could absorb more energy than the remaining embers could provide. The fire would still appear active for a while, but its reserve of usable heat would begin to fall. The size of the fuel also mattered. Very thin twigs caught quickly because heat could reach their entire surface, yet they burned away quickly for the same reason. Large pieces lasted longer, but they required a stronger bed of embers to begin burning steadily. If a heavy branch was placed onto a weak hearth too early, it could press down the smaller fuel, reduce airflow, and cover the hottest embers. A person trying to preserve the fire might therefore weaken it without doing anything foolish. The wrong fuel at the wrong stage was enough. Airflow created another unstable balance. Fire required oxygen, but the air moving through a shelter was never perfectly controlled. A hearth built in a sheltered hollow might be protected from wind, but receive too little fresh air once ash and charcoal settled around it. Flames could shorten, smoke could thicken, and combustion could slow. Near an entrance, the opposite problem could occur. A stronger draft might make the fire burn hotter for a time, consuming the remaining fuel faster than expected. A sudden gust could blow sparks away, shift ash across the ember bed, or cool exposed charcoal after the flame collapsed. The same opening that helped smoke escape could therefore either support or weaken the fire, depending on wind direction and strength. Weather outside did not need to become extreme. A small change in pressure, a passing gust, or air moving differently through cracks in the shelter could alter the hearth during the hours when no one was watching closely. Fuel arrangement mattered too. Wood placed too tightly restricted air between the pieces. Wood placed too loosely might fail to share enough heat for flame to pass from one piece to the next. Ash accumulating around the base could preserve some embers, yet too much could reduce oxygen. A branch rolling away from the center might continue glowing on one end while no longer heating the rest of the fuel. These changes were small, but the last hours before dawn offered time for small changes to become decisive. The final cause could simply be an insufficient reserve. No method of arranging a fire could create energy that was not present in the fuel. A colder night, stronger wind, wetter wood, or longer period before sunrise could consume the pile sooner than expected. People living in Ice Age conditions would have learned from repeated experience, but they could not measure the future perfectly. They worked with uncertain weather, uneven materials, limited daylight, and bodies already tired from the day. The fire might therefore weaken not because knowledge had failed, but because several ordinary limits arrived together. A damp branch, a blocked pocket of air, a brief gust, and a small fuel reserve could each seem harmless alone. Combined near dawn, they could bring a living hearth to the edge of extinction while the shelter remained quiet and the sleepers believed that morning was almost there. The people sleeping around the hearth were not careless observers standing outside the problem. They were part of it. Their bodies had already been shaped by the cold, the work of the day, hunger, interrupted sleep, and the effort of remaining warm. Fatigue does not simply make a person feel heavy. It reduces attention, slows judgment, and makes small changes harder to notice. A fire dying before dawn rarely announced itself with one clear signal. Its decline could appear through a weaker glow, a longer silence between cracks, a change in smoke, or the gradual cooling of the air. Each sign was subtle. A person waking for only a few seconds might notice one of them without understanding the whole pattern. They could see red beneath the ash and assume the hearth remained secure. They might hear another sleeper move and believe someone else had already checked it. They might feel cold, pull a hide closer, and return to sleep without realizing that the warmth lost around them was coming from the shrinking fire rather than from a passing draft. Experience could help people recognize danger, but experience could not remove the need for rest. Even skilled hunters, gatherers, toolmakers, and firekeepers had bodies that became tired. If the group had traveled far, carried meat, gathered fuel, cared for children, or endured poor weather, the need for sleep may have been unusually strong. A person intending to remain alert could drift into brief periods of sleep without noticing. Another might wake, decide that the remaining embers would last a little longer, and postpone adding fuel until the next moment of wakefulness. That next moment might come too late. Archaeology cannot identify who watched a fire, whether watches were formal or whether every group used the same practice. It would be misleading to invent a fixed system and present it as universal. What can be said is that any night fire required repeated attention, and human attention is never perfectly continuous. The problem became more difficult when responsibility was shared. Shared responsibility can protect a group because several people are capable of responding. It can also create uncertainty when no one knows whether another person has already acted. No spoken agreement needed to fail. The group might simply rely on familiar habits that had worked on previous nights. One person normally added wood when waking, another usually checked the entrance, a third slept closest to the fuel. If the usual person was more exhausted, injured, or sleeping in a different position, the routine could weaken without anyone recognizing it. The fire itself encouraged this confidence because it had survived many hours already. A hearth that continued through the early night could seem likely to continue through the short distance remaining before dawn. This was the cold paradox at the center of the night. The longer the fire had worked, the easier it became to trust it, even as the fuel beneath that trust was disappearing. The faint light outside could deepen the mistake. If morning seemed close, rising into the cold to rearrange wood might feel unnecessary. A person could decide to wait for daylight, not knowing that the remaining interval was longer or colder than it appeared. None of these decisions had to be irrational. They were made with limited information, under physical strain, in darkness, and without any way to measure exactly how much heat remained beneath the ash. By then, the hearth might need only a small intervention. A few dry twigs, a careful breath, or one piece of fuel placed correctly could preserve it. Yet that small intervention depended on someone waking fully enough to recognize the need. If no one did, the fire could pass through its final recoverable stage in silence, while the people around it remained convinced that it was still waiting for morning with them. The margin of safety had become almost invisible. When the final visible flame disappeared, the shelter did not become completely cold at once. Darkness arrived first. The moving light that had touched faces, hides, tools, and stone walls was gone, and the space beyond the hearth seemed to widen immediately. Yet heat remained in several places. Charcoal beneath the ash could still be warm. Stones beside the hearth could hold some of the energy they had absorbed. The ground nearest the fire might remain less cold than the floor farther away. Hides and bedding that had been drying could retain a little warmth of their own. For a short time, the people inside the shelter could still be surrounded by evidence of a fire that no longer gave a visible flame. This delay mattered because it could hide the seriousness of what had happened. A sleeper might open their eyes and see no flame, but feel enough warmth to believe that the hearth had merely settled into embers. Another person might notice the darkness without waking fully. The smell of smoke still clung to the air. A faint thread of smoke might continue rising from wood that was no longer burning strongly. The hearth could therefore appear quiet rather than dead. Even experienced fire users could not judge its condition from a distant sleeping place. The difference between a recoverable ember bed and a bed of cooling charcoal lay beneath the ash, where it could not be seen clearly without moving closer. Meanwhile, the shelter had begun to change. Without open flame, no new radiant heat crossed the occupied space. The nearest surfaces stopped receiving energy and began releasing what they had stored. This release was gradual. A warmed stone did not become cold in an instant, and neither did a hide lying near the hearth, but every part of the shelter was now moving in one direction. Heat was leaving and no longer being replaced. The cold floor continued drawing warmth from bedding and bodies. Air entering through gaps remained cold. Any wind crossing the entrance carried away some of the warmth that had gathered inside. The people closest together still shared body heat, but the protective zone created by the hearth had stopped renewing itself. At first, The change might be noticed only at the edges. A person lying farthest from the fire could feel the cold before someone near the center. The side of a body turned away from the hearth might cool sooner than the side that had faced it. Fingers, feet, and exposed parts of the face could begin to feel colder while the chest remained protected beneath hides. These signals did not necessarily cause immediate alarm. Sleepers often respond to cooling by curling inward, pulling coverings closer, or moving toward another body. Such movements could temporarily reduce discomfort without revealing its cause. The group might therefore adapt to the failing warmth for several minutes before anyone understood that the fire had truly gone out. The darkness itself also altered how the shelter was perceived. Objects that had been familiar in firelight disappeared. The fuel pile could no longer be judged from across the hearth. The position of tools, dry grass, or a hide screen became harder to see. A person waking in full darkness had to rely on memory, touch, smell, and sound before taking any action. This made the first response slower and more uncertain. Nothing had attacked the shelter. No wall had collapsed. The crisis began as an absence. No flame movement, no crack of burning wood, no new wave of heat. The fire had stopped doing its work, but the warmth left behind gave the group a brief and deceptive interval in which the consequences had not yet fully arrived. In that interval, the difference between a manageable problem and a dangerous one depended on whether someone recognized that the silence at the center of the shelter was no longer temporary. The first signs that something had changed were not necessarily dramatic. They were sensory gaps. The hearth no longer moved light across the shelter. Shadows that had shifted with every flame became still and then disappeared into one continuous darkness. A person who woke briefly might not understand this at once. Eyes adjusted slowly, and the shelter could seem almost unchanged for a few moments because memory supplied the shapes that sight could no longer confirm. Then another absence became noticeable. The familiar sounds of the fire had stopped. No branch settled, no ember cracked, no faint rustle came from flame passing over dry fibers. In a place where people had listened to the hearth for hours, silence could become a signal in itself. Yet silence was easy to misread. A low fire often became quiet before recovering. Wind could change the direction of sound. Someone farther from the hearth might hear only breathing, movement beneath hides, or air passing through the entrance. The smell of the shelter also began to shift. Smoke did not vanish immediately, because it remained in hair, clothing, bedding, and stone. A few cooling embers could still release a faint odor, but fresh smoke from active combustion was no longer being added. The air might smell flatter, colder, or less sharp, although such changes would have been difficult to judge while half asleep. Smell alone could not tell anyone whether heat remained beneath the ash. The body often noticed the problem before the mind understood it. Fingers could cool where they lay outside a hide. Feet might begin to feel colder against compressed bedding. The face could sense a draft that had been less noticeable while radiant heat reached it from the hearth. Someone near the edge of the sleeping group might wake first, not because they had seen the fire fail, but because the balance of warmth around their body had changed. They might pull their knees inward, cover the head, turn toward another sleeper, or move closer to the center. These responses could delay recognition because they reduced discomfort for a short time. The shelter would then become quieter again, even as it continued cooling. A child or an older adult might stir without waking fully. Another person might feel movement beside them and adjust a covering, still assuming the hearth remained alive beneath the ash. In this way, the group could respond to the consequences before identifying the cause. As cooling continued, muscles might begin producing small, involuntary movements to generate heat. Shivering would not necessarily begin at the same time for everyone, and it would depend on clothing, health, age, nourishment, and exposure. Even a slight tremor, however, could wake a person who had ignored the earlier darkness and silence. The timing of recognition depended on position. Those closest to warmed stones or thick bedding might remain comfortable longer. Those near an opening, a cold wall, or damp ground could feel the change sooner. There was no single moment when everyone understood at once. Awareness likely spread unevenly through the shelter, from one waking body to another. A person might finally listen for the fire and hear nothing. They might look toward the hearth and see no glow. They might extend a hand toward the center and feel less heat than expected. Only then would the scattered signs begin to form one conclusion. The darkness was not simply a low phase of the fire. The hearth was no longer maintaining the space. Even at this point, the situation was not yet fully known. Warmth could remain beneath the ash. A buried ember might still be recoverable. But the group had crossed an important threshold. The problem was no longer hidden inside the natural quiet of the night. Someone had begun to recognize that the cold entering the shelter was not temporary, and that waiting for dawn might no longer be enough. Someone eventually had to leave the relative warmth of the sleeping group and move toward the hearth. In complete darkness, this was a careful act rather than a sudden rush. The person might first reach for a familiar tool, a piece of wood, or the edge of the bedding to guide their position. The floor near the fire could contain sharp stone flakes, hot fragments, or uneven ground hidden from sight. Moving too quickly risked disturbing others, scattering ash, or pressing a hand onto material that was still hot. The first test may have been made without touching the center at all. A hand held near the hearth could detect whether any heat still rose from below. The smell of warm charcoal might be stronger at close range. A faint point of red could become visible once the eyes adjusted. If nothing could be seen, the ash still had to be examined, because its surface did not reveal what remained underneath. Using a stick, bone, or piece of fuel, the person could gently separate the upper layer. Archaeology cannot preserve this exact sequence of movements, and different groups may have used different tools or habits. The reconstruction rests on the behavior of embers, ash, and fuel rather than on the claim that every Ice Age hearth was checked in one fixed way. What mattered was the need to expose enough of the firebed to judge it without destroying the heat that might remain. This movement had to be controlled. Ash could preserve heat by covering embers, but disturbing it too roughly might expose small coals to cold air and cause them to cool faster. It could also release fine particles into the shelter and make breathing more difficult. Beneath the grey surface, several conditions were possible. There might be a deep red ember that brightened when air reached it. There might be a darker piece of charcoal that still felt warm but no longer held enough heat to ignite dry material. Or there might be only cold ash, indicating that the useful fire had already been lost. The difference between these states mattered more than the presence of smoke or the memory of flame. A living ember could preserve the entire chain of work that had created the hearth. With dry fibers, thin twigs, careful airflow, and patience, it might be returned to flame. A merely warm coal offered much less certainty. It could consume tinder without igniting it, leaving the group with less dry material than before. The person checking the hearth, therefore, had to judge not only whether heat remained, but whether that heat was sufficient to transfer into new fuel. This knowledge would have come from repeated practice, yet even practiced judgment could fail under cold, fatigue, and darkness. Breathing gently onto an ember could make its color clearer. A strong breath might scatter ash or cool a very small coal. Adding a large piece of wood too soon could bury the remaining heat. Adding material that was damp could draw energy away. Every action used part of the narrow opportunity still available. Other members of the group might now begin waking, not because they understood the hearth's condition, but because the person moving beside it had disturbed the quiet. Someone could search for dry tinder. Another might secure a covering around a child or close a gap where wind entered. The group's response could begin before anyone knew whether the fire would return. At this moment, the shelter stood between two possible outcomes. If a red core remained, the darkness might be brief. If the ash contained no recoverable heat, the problem had changed. They would no longer be maintaining an old fire. They would have to protect their remaining warmth while deciding whether a new flame could be made before dawn. The answer would shape every decision made during the remaining darkness before sunrise. Once the hearth had been judged too weak to warm the shelter, the first need was not necessarily to make a new flame. The group was already losing heat, and every movement away from the sleeping area could increase that loss. Before anyone searched for fuel or prepared tinder, the people still under hides could reduce the space between their bodies. This did not create new warmth, but it slowed the rate at which existing warmth escaped into the colder air around them. A body lying alone exposed more surface to the surrounding shelter. Several bodies pressed close together shared some of that protected space, especially when coverings were drawn over them as one layer, rather than divided into many smaller ones. The effect would have been limited, but in the final hours before dawn, even a limited delay mattered. The people nearest the edges of the group could move inward. Hides that had slipped aside could be pulled back across shoulders, legs, and feet. Openings between coverings could be closed. A person already awake might tuck loose material around another sleeper, not as a gesture of comfort alone, but as a practical way to reduce moving air beneath the covering. The group did not need a formal plan for this. Repeated cold nights would have taught them that warmth disappeared faster from gaps, exposed limbs, and isolated positions. The most vulnerable members may have been placed closer to the center, though archaeology cannot identify the exact arrangement of a particular sleeping group. Children, injured adults, and people weakened by age, illness, or poor nourishment would have had less ability to produce or preserve heat on their own. Bringing them inward could reduce exposure without requiring them to move far. At the same time, the group had to avoid compressing bedding so tightly that its insulating value disappeared. Dry grass, moss, hides, or other soft materials worked partly because they trapped still air. When crushed completely against cold ground, they offered less separation. The goal was therefore not simply to form the tightest possible mass, but to preserve a layer beneath the bodies while reducing the cold air moving between them. Position also mattered. Curling the body reduced the amount of exposed surface and helped protect hands and feet near the warmer center of the body. Turning the face away from a draft could reduce discomfort. Pulling a hide over the head preserved warmth, though breathing beneath heavy coverings could add moisture and make the material colder over time. Every solution carried a limit. Shared warmth could slow cooling, but it could not replace the heat that the fire had stopped producing. The shelter itself continued losing energy through its entrance, floor, and walls. A gap in a hide screen could now matter more than before, because there was no radiant heat to offset the incoming air. Someone near that opening might press a branch, stone, or folded hide against the gap without fully leaving the protected area. Such adjustments were small, but they bought time. Time was the most valuable resource after the fire went out. It allowed the group to assess the remaining embers, find dry material, and decide whether anyone should move into the colder parts of the shelter or outside. Without first protecting body heat, those actions could begin from a weaker position. A person who rose immediately and remained exposed while searching might become colder before the fire was restored. Someone already chilled would have less steady control in the hands and less patience for delicate work with tinder and embers. Preserving warmth was therefore part of restoring fire, even though no flame was being made yet. The group's first defense against the dark was not a dramatic act. It was a quiet rearrangement of bodies, hides, bedding, and space, holding together what the extinguished hearth had left behind. After the fire went out, the ground beneath the group became one of the most persistent sources of heat loss. Soil, stone, and packed earth did not need to feel frozen to draw warmth from a resting body. They only needed to remain colder than the skin and the layers above them. While the hearth had been active, part of this loss was balanced by radiant heat and warmer air near the center of the shelter. Once that supply stopped, every thin place in the bedding became more important. A shoulder resting on compressed grass, a hip pressing a hide against stone, or a foot extending beyond the prepared sleeping area could cool faster than the rest of the body. The people who were awake could respond by redistributing whatever insulating material remained. Dry grass, leaves, moss, hides or other available bedding could be pushed beneath exposed parts of the body. A folded hide could provide more protection than a single stretched layer because it trapped additional air. Even a bundle of dry plant material placed under the torso could slow contact with the cold floor. Archaeology rarely preserves the complete bedding arrangement of a night camp, but preserved plant beds show that people prepared resting surfaces in some Paleolithic settings. Their physical purpose, however, was consistent: to place something less conductive and more air-filled between the body and the ground. Drafts presented a different problem. Cold air could move beneath coverings, around the edge of a screen, through cracks between stones, or across an open side of a rock shelter. Because moving air continually replaced the slightly warmer air near the body, even a narrow gap could become noticeable after the fire stopped. The solution was not always to seal the shelter completely. Smoke from the old hearth could still linger, and any attempt to revive it would require ventilation. The aim was to redirect the strongest airflow rather than eliminate all air movement. A hide screen could be lowered, a branch frame adjusted, or loose material pressed against the base where the coldest air entered. People could shift their sleeping position so that their covered backs faced the draft and their faces remained where breathing was easier. Those nearest the exposed edge might move inward while another person placed bundled hides or dry vegetation along the boundary. The shape of the shelter affected every choice. Cold spread unevenly, so small changes in position could preserve valuable warmth. A cave wall blocked wind but could remain cold and damp. A deeper recess might be warmer, yet hold more smoke. The entrance offered easier access to fuel but cooled more quickly. Under a rock overhang, one side might be protected while another remained open to the night. The group, therefore, had to recognize which parts of the occupied space were losing heat fastest and abandon them temporarily. This meant making the warm area smaller. Bedding from the outer edge could be pulled toward the center. Empty space could be left near the entrance. Fuel, tools, and materials needed for firemaking could be moved within reach so that fewer people had to cross the cold floor. Each movement had to be measured. Standing for too long exposed the legs and torso. Kneeling on stone transferred heat away quickly. Bare hands used to move damp material could become cold and less precise. The work of improving insulation, therefore, had to be brief and shared. One person could lift a covering while another pushed bedding underneath. Someone closer to the entrance could reduce the draft while remaining partly covered. These actions did not make the shelter warm again. They slowed the speed at which it became colder. That distinction mattered. The group could not stop winter from entering, but it could decide how much surface, space, and moving air winter was allowed to reach before a new source of heat was found. Not every person in the shelter could respond to the loss of fire in the same way. Some could rise, move bedding, search for tinder, or adjust the entrance. Others might be too young, injured, weakened, or exhausted to protect themselves effectively. A child could lose warmth more quickly because of a smaller body and a greater proportion of exposed surface. An injured adult might be unable to curl tight. An older person might still possess deep knowledge of fire and shelter while having less strength to act on it. Poor nourishment, illness, and long exposure to cold could make any member of the group more vulnerable, regardless of age. Archaeology cannot show exactly who lay beside whom on a particular Ice Age night, but the survival of people with serious injuries and long-term impairments indicates that prehistoric communities sometimes cared for individuals who could not have managed entirely alone. When a fire went out before dawn, that care would have become part of the group's immediate thermal strategy. The most vulnerable person could be moved toward the center of the sleeping cluster, where wind reached less easily and shared coverings trapped more warmth. A child might be held against an adult's chest or abdomen, where the body's central warmth was greater than at the hands and feet. Someone unable to move could have bedding pushed beneath them and loose hides tucked around their sides. These actions had to be gentle. Moving an injured limb or lifting a weakened person could cause pain, consume energy, and open coverings that had been preserving warmth. The group therefore had to balance two needs: improving the person's position without exposing everyone else for too long. The people working near the cold hearth also needed protection. If one or two adults left the sleeping cluster to inspect ash or prepare tinder, their places under the coverings became empty, and the remaining bodies lost part of the shared warmth. Another person might move inward to close the gap. A hide could be folded temporarily over those staying behind. Tasks could be divided so that no one remained exposed longer than necessary. One person could handle the hearth, while another guarded the coverings and watched the condition of the weaker members. This was not only compassion in an emotional sense, it was practical cooperation. A child who became deeply chilled, an injured adult whose movements slowed, or an older person who could no longer respond clearly would require even more help later, the small. Protecting them early reduced the chance that the entire group would have to spend greater energy after sunrise. The darkness also made communication important. A person waking confused might not understand why bodies were moving or why the firelight had vanished. Quiet touch, familiar voices, and repeated instructions could help prevent unnecessary movement. Panic would waste energy, but complete silence could leave someone unaware that they needed to change position. The group's knowledge was therefore carried not only in tools and fuel, but in the way people guided one another through a problem they could barely see. None of these measures restored the fire. They preserved the human warmth that remained after the hearth failed. Before dawn, this distinction could decide how much strength was available for the next attempt. The people most capable of reviving the embers needed steady hands and clear judgment. Those most vulnerable needed protection from further cooling. By bringing bodies closer, redistributing coverings, and assigning different tasks, the group turned a collection of individual risks into one shared problem. The extinguished hearth had removed the center of heat from the shelter, but it had not removed the group's ability to create a smaller center from their own bodies. That center could not last indefinitely. It could only hold the cold back long enough for someone to decide whether the lost fire could still be brought back. The first attempt to recover the fire began with restraint. If heat still remained beneath the ash, rough movement could destroy the very thing the group needed to save. A person near the hearth would have to expose the firebed slowly, using a stick, a piece of bone, or another familiar tool, rather than placing bare fingers into material whose temperature was uncertain. The upper ash could be moved aside in small amounts, revealing darker charcoal beneath. What mattered was not whether the surface looked alive, but whether any piece still held a red core capable of brightening when air reached it. A living ember often gave only a faint signal. It might appear dull until the surrounding ash was lifted. It might glow along one narrow edge, while the rest remained black. In complete darkness, even a weak red point could become visible, but visibility alone did not guarantee that enough heat remained to ignite new fuel. The ember had to respond. Gentle airflow could provide that test. Blowing too strongly risked scattering ash, cooling a small coal, or sending fine particles into the shelter. Too little air might reveal nothing. The most useful approach was controlled and gradual, allowing oxygen to reach the ember without stripping away all the insulating ash around it. If the red color deepened, the group still possessed a connection to the old fire. That connection was fragile, but it meant they did not yet need to create flame from the beginning. The next step was to place something dry and easily heated close to the ember. This could have been fine plant fiber, dry grass, shredded bark, very small wood fragments, or another tinder material available in that landscape and known to that group. Archaeology does not preserve every bundle of tinder, and different environments offer different materials, so no single method can be treated as universal. The physical requirement remained the same. The first fuel had to be small enough to warm quickly and dry enough not to absorb the ember's remaining energy. It also had to be arranged so that air could pass through. Material packed too tightly could smother the coal. Material spread too loosely might fail to hold heat around it. A small nest or cluster could trap warmth while leaving spaces for oxygen. The person tending the hearth might place the ember within this material or draw the tinder toward the ember bed, depending on what remained hot and how delicate the coal had become. The task required steady hands. Cold fingers were less precise, and haste could break the ember apart or bury it beneath damp fuel. Others in the shelter could support the attempt without crowding the hearth. One person might search for the driest tinder kept near the sleeping area. Another could prepare thin twigs in order of size. Someone else could reduce a draft that was strong enough to scatter ash while leaving enough ventilation for smoke to escape. This division of work protected the small source of heat from interruption. The first visible success might not be flame. It could be a brighter glow, a thin thread of smoke, or a faint change in smell as the tinder began to heat. Smoke without ignition was not yet enough. It could mean the material was damp or that the ember was weakening. The group had to continue adding air carefully while resisting the urge to place larger wood too soon. If a tiny flame appeared, it needed to pass from tinder to the thinnest fuel before any heavier branch was added. At every stage, the fire could still fail. Yet if one ember remained responsive beneath the ash, the extinguished hearth was not entirely lost. The group was working with the final stored heat of the previous night, trying to carry it across the narrow gap between darkness and flame. Once a living ember had been found, the next challenge was not simply to add fuel, but to add it in the right order. A glowing coal could contain enough heat to begin the process, yet not enough to ignite a thick branch or a damp bundle. The first material had to warm quickly. Fine dry fibers, shredded bark, soft grass, thin wood shavings, or another suitable tinder could be placed where the ember's heat would gather rather than escape. The arrangement mattered as much as the material itself. If the tinder was packed too tightly, air could not move through it. If it was too loose, the heat spread away before any one part reached ignition. The goal was to create a small pocket in which heat, fuel, and oxygen met at the same time. A faint thread of smoke showed that the material was changing, but smoke did not guarantee success. Damp tinder could smoke without catching. A weak ember could darken after giving up the last of its heat. The person tending the fire had to watch for a stronger sign, a deepening glow, a growing warmth, or a small flame that remained present for more than a moment. That first flame was extremely vulnerable. It could disappear under the weight of a single branch, be blown out by a sudden draft, or consume the tinder before reaching the next layer of fuel. For this reason, the smallest twigs had to come next. They needed to be thin enough to ignite from the brief flame and dry enough not to cool it. Several could be arranged with spaces between them so that air continued to flow. Only after these began burning steadily could slightly larger pieces be added. The fire had to climb through sizes, moving from ember to tinder, from tinder to fine twigs, and from fine twigs to branches capable of lasting longer. Skipping one step risked losing the entire attempt. The work was made harder by the conditions inside the shelter. Fingers could be cold and stiff. Eyes had only a weak glow to guide them. Smoke from the tinder could drift toward the face. The person rebuilding the hearth might have to lean close while protecting hair, hides, and bedding from sparks. Others could help by passing fuel in the correct order, shielding the flame from an excessive draft, or moving dry materials within reach. Their cooperation reduced the time the fire tender spent searching in darkness. It also prevented too many people from crowding the hearth and disturbing the fragile airflow. The group had to resist another temptation, making the new fire large too quickly. A sudden pile of fuel could smother the flame, while a large blaze would consume the remaining reserve rapidly. The immediate need was not brightness, but continuity. A modest flame that transferred heat into a stable bed of embers was more useful than a brief flare that vanished before dawn. As the smaller branches caught, the hearth began producing new radiant heat. The nearest hands and faces could feel the change first. Smoke became more regular. Familiar sounds returned as thin wood cracked and settled. Yet even then, the fire was not secure. Larger fuel still had to be placed carefully, and damp pieces might need to be warmed near the edge before being added. Ash had to remain controlled and the draft had to support combustion without carrying sparks into the sleeping area. The fire was being rebuilt one layer at a time. Its return depended not on one dramatic spark, but on a sequence of correct, patient decisions. A single hurried movement could still undo the careful work of many minutes. When the first steady flame finally held, the group had recovered more than light. It had restored the center around which warmth, movement, and the remaining hours before dawn could once again be organized. If the ash contained no living ember, the task changed completely. The group could no longer preserve heat from the old fire. It had to create a new source of heat from cold materials, and that was slower, less certain, and more demanding than reviving a coal. Archaeology shows that prehistoric people were capable of producing fire in at least some places and periods, but it does not justify assuming that every Ice Age group used the same method or carried the same equipment. Some communities may have struck flint against iron-rich minerals such as pyrite or marcasite to create sparks. Other fire-making traditions may have relied on friction between carefully prepared pieces of wood. Direct evidence for these methods is uneven because wood, tinder, and mineral fragments do not always survive, and objects used for several purposes can be difficult to identify with certainty. What can be said is that creating fire required more than two objects and a simple motion. It depended on dry tinder, prepared tools, practiced movement, and conditions that allowed a tiny spark or hot fragment to grow. Before dawn, every one of these requirements became harder to meet. The tools had to be found in darkness. Tinder that had absorbed moisture might fail even when sparks reached it. Cold hands could not strike, drill, or control small materials as steadily. A person already shivering would have difficulty repeating precise movements for long. The group therefore had to prepare the attempt before spending energy on it. The driest material available might be taken from a bundle kept beneath coverings, inside a hide container, or near the former hearth. Fine plant fibers could be separated and loosened so that air moved through them. Bark, fungus, powdered plant matter, or other locally known substances might have been used where available, but no single tinder should be treated as universal across the Ice Age world. The material had to accept a spark or glowing particle and hold it long enough for heat to spread. If percussion was used, the angle and force of the strike mattered. A spark was brief, and many attempts might produce nothing useful. If friction was used, the wooden pieces had to be suitably dry and prepared, while repeated motion had to generate and concentrate enough heat to form a glowing fragment. Neither process guaranteed immediate flame. The first success would usually be a tiny point of heat, not a burning branch. That point then had to be transferred into tinder, protected from excessive wind and supplied with controlled air. Only after the tinder began glowing strongly could it be folded into a larger bundle and encouraged toward flame. The effort might consume valuable minutes and physical strength while the shelter continued cooling. This created a difficult decision. Continuing to attempt fire-making could eventually restore the hearth, but repeated failure could exhaust the person best able to work and use up the driest tinder. The group might pause to warm hands between other bodies, exchange the task, or reassess the materials. Someone with the greatest experience could guide another person whose hands were steadier. Knowledge alone was not enough, but cooperation could preserve the knowledge when one body became tired. A successful flame would still have to pass through the same careful sequence of fine fuel and larger branches. A failed attempt did not prove that the method was unknown. Moisture, wind, poor tinder, damaged tools, or simple bad fortune could defeat a skilled person. If no flame appeared, the group would have to decide whether to continue, wait for daylight, seek fire from another occupied camp, or survive the remaining darkness without it. The loss of the final ember therefore exposed a deeper truth about Ice Age fire. Possessing the knowledge to make it did not mean that fire was always available. Every new flame still depended on materials, bodies, weather, time, and the narrow opportunity before the cold became harder to resist. The loss of fire created a decision that could not be postponed, but neither choice was safe. Remaining inside the shelter preserved the warmth still held beneath hides, between bodies, and within the bedding. Leaving meant crossing colder ground, opening the protected edge of the camp, and exposing at least one person to wind and darkness. Yet, if no usable fuel remained beside the hearth, staying inside also allowed the shelter to cool without replacement. The group had to decide whether the remaining hours before dawn were short enough to endure without fire, or long enough for the cold to become dangerous. They had no clock and no exact measurement of temperature. They could judge only the faintness of the sky, the direction of the wind, the condition of their bodies, and what they remembered about the landscape beyond the shelter. A steady wind, falling snow, or wet clothing could make waiting more costly. A calm night, thick dry bedding, and a sky already beginning to lighten could make remaining together the safer choice. The presence of children, injured people, or anyone already shivering strongly would also change what the group could risk. The distance to fuel mattered immediately. Dry branches, stored only a few steps away, could be reached with limited exposure. Wood lying farther across snow, frozen ground, or uneven stone required more time and energy. In open-steppe environments, suitable woody fuel may have been sparse, while people in other settings could gather shrubs, grasses, bone, or locally available combustible materials. No fuel source was universal across the Ice Age, and archaeological studies show that prehistoric hearths could contain several kinds of burned material. What mattered on this particular night was not what could burn in theory, but what could be found dry enough, quickly enough, before the people inside lost too much heat. A person sent outside would need some protection. Hides could be wrapped closely, but taking a shared covering reduced insulation for those who remained. Foot coverings might already be damp. Hands needed to stay functional enough to gather, break, and carry fuel, yet thick coverings could make those tasks slower. Cold exposure can narrow blood flow to the hands and make precise movements more difficult, while shivering increases the body's production of heat at the cost of energy. The longer the search continued, the harder it could become to handle tinder and rebuild the hearth after returning. This made a long, uncertain search especially costly before dawn. Darkness added another limit. Familiar paths looked different without firelight or moonlight. Snow could hide branches and holes, loose stone could shift underfoot. A person moving beyond the shelter might also lose the entrance from view if terrain, wind-blown snow, or darkness concealed it. The group, therefore, had reason to keep the search close, deliberate, and connected to the occupied space. One person might remain near the entrance, listening and guiding. Another might search only within a known area where fuel had been seen earlier. No heroic journey was required, and a distant search could create more danger than the fire it was meant to restore. Staying inside was not passive. Those who remained could continue protecting the vulnerable, prepare tinder, rearrange bedding, and gather every small combustible fragment already within reach. A broken wooden shaft, dry scrap from tool-making, grass from unused bedding, or a saved piece of bark might extend an ember or support a new flame, although useful equipment would not be burned casually unless the need justified it. The decision was therefore not simply inside or outside. It could be divided into smaller steps. Search the shelter first, test the remaining materials, send the fewest people necessary, and limit how long they remained exposed. When an Ice Age fire went out before dawn, survival depended less on choosing one perfect action than on refusing to spend warmth, fuel, and human strength without knowing what each action might return. The decision to leave the shelter could not be made from cold alone. The group had to consider what lay between them and the fuel they needed. A branch visible in daylight might now be hidden beneath snow, darkness, or drifting ash. A familiar slope could become difficult when the ground was frozen. Loose stones, ice, roots, and uneven soil increased the chance of falling, and a fall before dawn could turn one problem into two. An injured ankle, a cut hand, or a wet covering would make it harder to rebuild the fire after returning. Terrain, therefore, shaped the value of every possible search. Fuel lying close across level ground might be worth the effort. Fuel beyond a steep bank, exposed ridge, stream, or narrow passage might not be. Snow altered both distance and effort. A short path through deep snow could demand more energy than a longer path over firm ground. Snow could also hide dry material while wetting whatever was collected. Branches beneath a tree or overhang might remain more useful than wood lying openly on the ground, but finding them required knowledge of the immediate landscape. Wind added another layer of judgment. A strong wind increased heat loss from exposed skin and carried warmth away from clothing. It could also make the shelter itself cool faster, creating pressure to restore the fire quickly. Yet the same wind made going outside more dangerous and made a newly lit flame harder to protect. The direction mattered as much as the strength. A person moving into the wind lost more heat at the front of the body and could have difficulty seeing through snow or dust. Moving with the wind made travel easier in one direction, but could make returning harder. The group needed to think not only about reaching fuel, but about carrying it back. Distance could not be judged in steps alone. It included the time needed to identify dry material, break or gather it, and return while still able to use the hands. A person who reached the fuel but came back shivering violently might add less to the group than the wood they carried. The number of capable adults therefore mattered. A larger group could divide tasks. One person could search, another remain near the entrance, and others prepare tinder and protect the sleepers. A smaller group had less flexibility. Sending one adult outside might leave too few people to care for children, support an injured member, or work at the hearth. Sending two could improve safety during the search, but remove more body heat from the sleeping cluster. Physical condition mattered even more than numbers. The strongest-looking person was not always the best choice. Someone with dry footwear, steady hands, good knowledge of nearby fuel, and less severe fatigue might be more useful than someone stronger but already chilled. A person who had traveled far, eaten little, or carried an injury could lose function quickly in the cold. The group also had to consider the condition of those staying behind. If several people were already shivering, if coverings were damp, or if the shelter admitted strong wind, waiting carried increasing risk. If most remained warm and dawn seemed close, leaving might spend more energy than it saved. These judgments could not be exact. They were based on signs, memory, and shared experience. The group might test the situation in small stages, open the entrance briefly, feel the wind, look for nearby fuel, and return before exposure became serious. A short failed search could still provide information. It could show that snow had buried the closest branches, or that the wind was stronger than expected. That knowledge could support the next decision. The question was never simply whether fuel existed outside, it was whether the group could reach it, carry it, and still possess enough warmth and control to turn it into fire before dawn. Once the decision had been made to try to restore the fire, the group needed more than fuel, it needed order. Too many people moving at once would open coverings, disturb bedding, scatter ash, and waste the little warmth that remained. Too few people acting would place every task on one tired body. The safest response was to divide the work according to position, ability, and immediate need. One person could remain at the hearth, responsible for judging the embers, arranging tinder, and controlling airflow. This task required the steadiest hands and the clearest view of the firebed. It did not necessarily belong to the strongest adult. Someone with more experience recognizing charcoal, smoke, and tinder might be more useful than someone able to carry a heavier load. A second person could prepare fuel in stages, separating fine dry material from thicker pieces and keeping damp wood away from the first flame. This reduced delay at the critical moment when a small ember or spark needed something ready to catch. A third person might control the entrance or windbreak, allowing enough air for combustion while preventing a strong draft from scattering ash or cooling the tinder. Others could remain beneath the coverings, keeping children, injured people, and those already chilled close together. Their role was not passive. By holding the sleeping cluster stable, they preserved the human warmth on which the entire group still depended. If someone had to search outside, another person could wait near the entrance, listening for movement and helping guide the return. This mattered because the shelter's opening might be difficult to see from only a short distance in darkness, snow, or wind. The person returning with fuel might also need immediate help removing wet outer layers, passing the driest material to the hearth, or warming hands before attempting delicate work. Communication had to remain simple. In darkness, people could not rely on gestures or distant expressions. Short instructions, familiar voices, and touch could coordinate movement without waking everyone fully or creating confusion. One person might ask for thin twigs, another for dry fibers, another to close a gap near the floor. The exact words are unknowable, but shared language and practiced habits would have allowed a group to work through a familiar type of problem. Not every action required discussion. Repeated experience could turn some responses into routine. One person lifted a covering while another moved bedding. One protected tinder while another adjusted the draft. One watched the vulnerable while another worked at the hearth. Cooperation also allowed tasks to change hands before exhaustion became dangerous. A person who had been blowing gently on an ember could become lightheaded or begin shivering. Another could take over while the first returned briefly beneath the hides. Someone whose fingers had become stiff could exchange places with a person whose hands were warmer. This rotation preserved skill by protecting the body that carried it. The group had to avoid one further mistake, allowing the effort to restore fire to consume all available attention. While several people focused on the hearth, the shelter still needed watching. A child could move toward the ash. A hide screen could loosen. A gust could send smoke across the bedding. Fuel placed too close could catch unexpectedly. The division of labor, therefore, included preventing new problems while solving the first one. If the fire returned, it would do so because several small responsibilities had remained connected. If it failed, the same organization would still help the group endure the remaining darkness. The person at the hearth could stop before wasting all the tinder. The person at the entrance could judge whether another search was possible. Those under the coverings could report who was becoming colder. The loss of fire had created a shared crisis, and the group's best response was to make sure that no single person carried the entire cold, the entire risk, or the entire responsibility alone. Beyond the reach of the hearth, the night had always remained dark. The fire had never illuminated the whole landscape, and its disappearance did not suddenly create a new world outside the shelter. What changed was the group's ability to see and interpret what was already there. A low flame could reveal the entrance, nearby rocks, stored fuel, and movement close to the camp. Without it, familiar shapes disappeared, distances became uncertain, and every sound carried more weight. A branch moving in the wind, an animal passing far away, or loose stones shifting under cold air could seem closer than it was. This made darkness dangerous mainly because it reduced information. It did not mean that a predator immediately entered the shelter the moment the last ember died. Large carnivores did not respond to fire in one simple, universal way. Their behavior depended on species, hunger, previous experience, distance, wind direction, the number of people present, and the physical shape of the camp. Some animals might avoid human voices, scent, movement, and unfamiliar activity even without visible flame. Others could approach the wider area out of curiosity or because they were following prey, carrion, or a known path. The loss of fire changed one part of the group's protection, but it did not erase every other signal that humans were present. The shelter still contained many bodies, strong smells, tools, hides, stored materials, and the sounds of breathing and movement. A cave entrance, rock wall, brush barrier, or narrow passage could still limit access. People could still listen, speak, strike objects together, or move as a group if something came near. Firelight had helped extend awareness outward, but the group was not helpless when the light disappeared. The greater danger lay in uncertainty. A sound could not be identified quickly. The people closest to the entrance might not know whether movement came from wind, a small scavenger, a herd animal, or a large carnivore. Rising to investigate meant opening coverings and losing warmth. Remaining still preserved heat, but allowed doubt to continue. This tension could make the shelter feel less secure than it had minutes earlier, even when nothing outside had changed. In that reduced field of awareness, the group could listen before acting. Someone near the entrance might remain still and compare repeated sounds, while another kept the vulnerable covered. A single noise was not proof of danger. Repetition, direction, pace, and response to human voices offered better clues. Patience protected both warmth and judgment, preventing fear from turning every unseen movement into an immediate threat. Archaeological sites show that humans and carnivores sometimes used the same caves and rock shelters, but usually at different times. Layers of bone, teeth, tools, ash, and occupation debris can overlap across long periods. They do not prove that humans and dangerous animals confronted one another every night. A cave used by people during one season could later be occupied by hyenas, bears, or other animals after the people had left. The evidence supports a shared landscape, not a constant scene of attack. Before dawn, a group whose fire had gone out would still have taken nearby animals seriously. Food scraps, fresh meat, bone, or fat could carry odors beyond the shelter. Wind could move those odors in changing directions, yet an animal detecting the camp would still have to decide whether approaching several awake humans was worth the risk. Predators also avoided injury, and adult humans acting together were not easy prey. The fire had strengthened the boundary between camp and darkness, but that boundary also consisted of numbers, noise, memory of the terrain, and the structure of the shelter itself. When the flame vanished, the night did not instantly move inward. What moved inward was the edge of human vision, leaving the group to judge the outside world through sound, smell, and the uncertain knowledge that something could be present without yet coming closer. A cave or rock shelter could preserve traces from many different occupants across hundreds or thousands of years. Human groups might leave hearths, stone tools, cut-marked bones, ash, and discarded food remains. Later, after those people moved on, hyenas, bears, wolves, or other carnivores could enter the same place and leave teeth, dung, gnawed bones, bedding areas, or denning traces of their own. Seasonal return, long gaps between occupations, and repeated use by different species could produce a dense archaeological record in which human and animal remains appear close together. This closeness can be misleading if it is imagined as one continuous scene. A layer containing both tools and carnivore-modified bones does not automatically prove that people and predators shared the shelter on the same night. Sediment can mix. Objects can be moved by water, burrowing animals, trampling, later occupation, or the collapse of the shelter floor. Even when the deposits are well preserved, the time represented by a thin layer may still be far longer than a single human stay. Archaeologists, therefore, examine the exact position of remains, the condition of bones, the sequence of sediments, burning, cut marks, tooth marks, and other details before deciding how the shelter was used. Some sites show stronger evidence of alternating occupation. People used the space for a period, left it, and carnivores entered later. At other sites, humans may have scavenged animals killed by predators, while predators may have returned to bones left by humans. These relationships were varied and changed across place and time. The important point for a fire that went out before dawn is that the group inside the shelter would not have treated the wider landscape as empty. They may have known from tracks, droppings, bones, smells, or previous encounters that large animals also used caves, paths, and sheltered ground. A place protected from wind and snow was useful to many species, not only to humans. That knowledge would make the loss of fire more unsettling, but it still would not mean an animal was waiting just outside. The most immediate response was likely to rely on evidence available in that moment. Fresh sounds near the entrance mattered more than ancient bones deeper in the cave. A recent track in snow mattered more than a tooth-marked bone left from another season. Wind direction, animal odor, repeated movement, and the reactions of other people offered better information than fear alone. If the group had chosen the shelter carefully, it may also have occupied a position that was easier to defend: a narrow entrance, a raised ledge, a wall at the back, or an area with clear access to tools. These features remained after the fire went out. A carnivore approaching such a space would still face several adult humans, confined access, unfamiliar noise, and the risk of injury. On the other hand, a shelter with multiple openings, deep passages, or poor visibility could create more uncertainty. The group's knowledge of the site would then be especially valuable. They would know which direction sounds traveled, where air entered, and whether another passage connected to the occupied area. Firelight had made these judgments easier, but repeated use of a place created memory that darkness could not erase. Even without sight, people could compare a sound with known echoes, recognize the scrape of loose stone near one entrance, or notice when an odor arrived from a passage rarely used by the group. Such details did not remove risk, but they prevented the darkness from becoming completely unknown. The archaeological record, therefore, supports caution rather than a single dramatic story. Humans and carnivores sometimes competed for protected spaces, sometimes used them at different times, and sometimes interacted indirectly through abandoned food or carcasses. When the flame disappeared before dawn, the group's danger came not from an inevitable attack, but from losing one layer of warning in a landscape they already understood was shared. Even without fire, the group was not stripped of every protection. The shelter itself still shaped what could approach, from which direction, and how quickly. A narrow entrance forced any large animal to come through a confined space rather than from all sides at once. A raised ledge, steep slope, rock wall, or deep recess could reduce access further. In an open camp, a barrier of branches, hides, stones, or stored materials could create noise when disturbed and slow an approach long enough for people to react. These features were not perfect defenses, and archaeology cannot show that every Ice Age camp was deliberately built to resist predators. Yet the choice of resting place was rarely meaningless. People who repeatedly lived in cold landscapes would have learned which positions blocked wind, offered visibility, limited access, and allowed escape if necessary. That knowledge continued to matter after the hearth went dark. Numbers were another protection. A lone person in darkness faced a different risk from several adults gathered together. Large carnivores also had to avoid injury, and approaching a group of awake humans carrying stone tools, wooden shafts, or heavy objects could be dangerous. The group did not need to see an animal clearly to make its presence known. Voices, coordinated movement, striking wood or stone, and the sound of several people rising could communicate that the shelter was occupied and defended. Such actions cost energy and could expose bodies to cold, so they would not be used for every uncertain noise. But if movement came closer, the group could increase its response in stages. One person might listen while others remained covered. A second sound could bring another adult awake. Repeated movement near the entrance might lead people to gather tools and speak more loudly. This gradual response prevented the group from wasting warmth on every sound, while still allowing it to become active when evidence increased. A barrier could also force an approaching animal to pause, change direction, or touch material that produced sound. That brief delay might be enough for sleeping people to wake and organize themselves. Tools also retained value after the fire disappeared. A sharp stone edge, a wooden spear, a heavy branch, or a hand-sized rock could support defense at close range, although the exact equipment varied greatly across time and place. Fire had made these objects easier to locate, so keeping them in familiar positions near the sleeping area would have mattered. In darkness, memory replaced sight. A person could reach toward the place where a tool was normally kept, pass it to another, or move toward a known position beside the entrance. The same spatial order described earlier in the shelter now became part of security. If the camp had been arranged carelessly, darkness made every object harder to use. If it had been organized through habit, the group could still act without seeing clearly. Human senses, other than sight, also remained useful. Hearing could detect direction, pace, repetition, and distance, though echoes and wind could distort them. Smell could sometimes reveal smoke, animal scent, blood, or damp fur. Touch could guide movement along walls, bedding, and stored materials. None of these senses provided certainty, but together they reduced the unknown. The group could compare what one person heard with what another noticed. Shared judgment was more reliable than a single frightened interpretation. The extinguished fire had removed light and warmth, but not memory, cooperation, tools, or the physical shape of the shelter. Those remaining protections did not guarantee safety. They only made the darkness less absolute. Before dawn, that difference was important. The people inside were not waiting helplessly for whatever might come. They were listening from a place they had chosen, surrounded by others, holding knowledge of the terrain and objects prepared by human hands. The night had become harder to read, but it had not become completely beyond their control. Dawn did not rescue the shelter in a single moment. The first change was visual. A faint grey light began to separate the entrance from the darkness around it, and familiar shapes slowly returned. The edge of a hide screen, the outline of stored fuel, the position of tools, and the bodies lying beneath coverings became easier to recognize. This new visibility mattered. It allowed the group to judge the hearth more accurately, find dry material, inspect the entrance, and see who had become cold or weak during the final hours of night. Yet light and warmth did not arrive together. The sun might still be below the horizon, hidden by cloud, hills, trees, or the walls of a valley. In some valleys and hollows, denser cold air could remain pooled near the ground after the upper slopes had begun receiving light. A shelter facing away from the rising sun might stay shaded for much longer. Snow could brighten the landscape without warming it, giving the morning a clear appearance while the air and surfaces remained intensely cold. Even after sunrise, its energy needed time to warm the ground, the air, and the surfaces inside the shelter. Stone that had cooled through the night remained cold. Bedding compressed against the floor still held little warmth. Hides that had absorbed moisture did not dry merely because the sky had brightened. The air entering through the entrance could remain near its coldest point of the night, especially in shaded terrain or during severe winter weather. The people inside, therefore, entered morning with better information, but not immediate physical relief. Their bodies also carried the effects of the night forward. Someone who had been shivering had already used additional energy to generate heat. Fingers and feet might remain numb or painful as circulation changed. Muscles could feel stiff after hours of lying still and curling inward. A person who had slept poorly would wake with reduced attention and less steady movement. Hunger could deepen the sense of cold because the body needed energy to produce heat. None of this meant that every extinguished fire led to severe injury. The outcome depended on clothing, bedding, shelter, wind, health, duration of exposure, and whether the group had restored even a small flame. But the return of daylight did not erase those conditions. It only made them easier to assess. People could now look for changes in skin color, unusual confusion, strong or weakening shivering, difficulty using the hands, or a person who was slower to respond than expected. They would not have described these signs with modern medical language, yet repeated experience with cold could have taught them which conditions required attention. Movement had to begin carefully. Standing too quickly after a long cold night could be difficult for stiff legs and feet. Vigorous activity produced heat, but it also consumed energy and could cause injury if the body was numb. The first actions were likely small: flexing hands, rubbing limbs, sitting upright under coverings, changing damp layers, and bringing the most chilled people closer to any renewed heat. If the hearth had been relit, its flame still needed time to warm nearby bodies and materials. A newly made fire was not yet a powerful source of heat. It had to be fed gradually, protected from wind, and prevented from consuming the remaining fuel too quickly. If no fire had returned, daylight at least made gathering fuel safer and more efficient. Branches could be seen, paths could be judged, and the shelter entrance was easier to find. Morning, therefore, changed what the group could do before it changed how warm they felt. It widened their choices while the cold remained present. The long night was ending, but its consequences were still held in the stone, the bedding, the damp hides, and the tired bodies waiting for the first reliable heat of the day. Once daylight made the shelter visible again, the group could begin assessing what the night had done to each person. This did not require modern medical knowledge. Repeated exposure to cold would have taught people to notice when someone moved normally, when hands remained useful, when shivering was strong, and when a person seemed unusually quiet or slow to respond. The first concern would not have been comfort alone, but function. Could the person sit up, speak clearly, hold a tool, and take part in the work needed to restore warmth? Someone who was alert and shivering still produced heat, even if they felt miserable. Someone who had become confused, weak, or unable to use the hands required more protection and closer attention. Archaeology cannot preserve these individual examinations, but it does show that prehistoric communities sometimes supported people through serious injuries and long periods of dependence. That wider evidence makes cooperative care during a cold emergency a reasonable part of the reconstruction, without allowing us to claim one exact procedure. The most chilled members could remain under dry coverings while others worked around them. Damp outer layers might be loosened or replaced if drier material was available, but exposing the whole body would increase heat loss. Changes, therefore, had to be made gradually, protecting the torso while wet or compressed material was removed from one area at a time. Gentle movement could help a person regain control, yet forceful activity was not always appropriate. Numb feet on uneven stone, stiff joints, and exhausted muscles increased the chance of falling. Those who were able could flex fingers, shift position, sit upright, and move closer to the renewed hearth. Those who were weaker might need another person to support the body and keep coverings closed. Food and water also mattered, but neither could solve the problem instantly. If prepared food remained, small amounts could help restore energy. Frozen food might need to be thawed, and water stored in cold conditions might be difficult to drink. A fire, if it had been relit, could warm these things gradually. If no flame had yet returned, daylight allowed the group to search more safely for fuel and to choose dry material with greater care. At the same time, the shelter itself needed attention. Bedding that had become damp from ground moisture, breath, melting frost, or condensed smoke had to be spread where air and any available warmth could reach it. Hides could be turned so that colder, wetter surfaces faced the fire without being placed close enough to scorch. Plant material that had compressed during the night could be loosened, shaken, or replaced. Ash from the failed hearth might be cleared selectively, while any remaining charcoal was saved for examination or reuse. The group also had to restore the ordinary activities that the fire had interrupted. Tools needed to be found and inspected. Food had to be checked. The entrance and windbreak required repair if they had shifted during the night. Fuel had to be collected before the renewed flame consumed the small reserve gathered before dawn. These tasks were not separate from recovery. They created the conditions in which bodies, bedding, food, and shelter could become warm again. The morning after a failed fire was therefore not a simple return to routine. It was a careful rebuilding of function. Each person, each layer of bedding, each dry branch, and each usable tool had to be brought back into the working order that the night had weakened. The fire going out before dawn had not ended when light appeared. Its effects continued into every delayed movement and every damp material that could no longer protect the body as well as before. Morning gave the group the chance to reverse those losses, but only through attention and shared work. The colder members needed warmth first, while the stronger members had to spend their remaining energy without becoming chilled themselves. By full daylight, the group could begin repairing not only the shelter, but the chain of decisions that had allowed the fire to fail. The first need was a new reserve of fuel. Gathering could now extend beyond the small area searched in darkness. People could see which branches were dry, which pieces were rotten, and which materials had been protected beneath rock, vegetation, or overhangs. In open environments where wood was limited, they might collect shrubs, grasses, bone, dung, or other combustible materials known to them, depending on region and season. No single fuel source served every Ice Age community, but the lesson of the night was the same. What mattered was not only finding something that could burn, but finding enough of it in several sizes before darkness returned. Fine tinder had to be kept separate from larger fuel. Thin twigs needed to be dry and easy to reach. Longer burning pieces had to be placed where they could warm gradually without becoming damp. The group could also reconsider the hearth itself. If smoke had pooled, the fire might be shifted slightly or the opening adjusted. If wind had consumed fuel too quickly, a screen or stone arrangement could reduce the strongest draft while preserving ventilation. If the hearth had been too close to bedding, the occupied space could be reorganized. Archaeological hearths show that fire placement often related to the shape of shelters and the distribution of activities, but they do not reveal one universal design. Any adjustment would have depended on local stone, soil, airflow, available materials, and the group's own experience of that place. The failed fire could also change how embers were protected. A deep bed of charcoal might be preserved beneath ash rather than left exposed to moving air. A suitable piece of slow-burning fuel could be added before everyone slept. Dry tinder might be stored closer to the hearth, but far enough from sparks. One or more people could agree to check the fire at intervals, although we cannot know how formal such arrangements were in any particular prehistoric group. What can be said is that maintaining a night fire required repeated attention, and a group that had just endured its loss would have reason to make that attention more reliable. Responsibility could be shared clearly. The person nearest the fuel could know when to add it. Another could listen for changes in the fire or wind. Someone waking naturally during the night could check the ember bed before returning to sleep. These habits did not guarantee success. Weather could still change, fuel could still be damp, and fatigue could still overcome intention. Preparation reduced risk. It did not remove uncertainty. The group also had to decide how much fuel to burn and how much to preserve. A large flame might warm the shelter quickly, but consume the reserve before dawn. A smaller, carefully maintained fire could last longer, yet might not reach the outer sleepers. The answer lay in balance. Enough heat to support the occupied space, enough airflow to keep combustion steady, and enough stored fuel to survive the longest hours. By afternoon, hides and bedding could be turned towards sunlight or dry air where conditions allowed. Tools used for fire-making could be inspected. Tinder bundles could be renewed. Paths to nearby fuel could be remembered or cleared. These were ordinary tasks, but they transformed the previous night from an isolated failure into practical knowledge. The extinguished fire had revealed where cold entered, where bedding compressed, which fuel smoked, who woke first, and which materials were hardest to find in darkness. None of this had to become a spoken lesson in the modern sense. It could be carried in changed placement, repeated gestures, and new habits. When evening returned, the group would still face the same winter, the same limits of fire, and the same need for sleep. But the next hearth would be built beside the memory of the one that had failed. The failure of a fire before dawn revealed something that a successful night could easily hide. Making flame was only one part of living with fire. The harder skill was keeping it useful through changing hours, changing weather, and changing human strength. A group might know how to strike sparks, protect an ember, or feed a small flame, yet still lose the hearth if fuel was gathered too late, if damp wood was misjudged, if wind changed, or if exhaustion interrupted attention. Fire, therefore, demanded more than technique. It demanded anticipation. People had to think beyond the moment when the flame was bright and consider what the shelter would need many hours later, when everyone was colder, sleepier, and less willing to move. This kind of planning was practical rather than abstract. It appeared in the size of the fuel pile, the placement of dry tinder, the position of the sleeping group, and the choice of who lay nearest the hearth. It appeared in the decision to save a dense branch for the last part of the night, instead of burning it earlier for comfort. It appeared in the habit of protecting embers under ash, keeping bedding away from sparks, and remembering where additional fuel could be found in darkness. None of these actions guaranteed that the fire would survive. They only increased the margin between a living hearth and a cold one. That margin was often made from small preparations completed before the danger became visible. The fire that went out before dawn showed why timing mattered so much. A branch added at midnight might burn away before the coldest hours. Tinder stored in a damp place might become useless when it was finally needed. A screen placed badly could allow a draft to consume fuel faster than expected. The group had to connect an action taken in daylight with a condition that would not arrive until deep into the night. In this sense, maintaining fire was also a form of remembering the future. People used the evidence of earlier nights to prepare for a later hour they could not yet see. Archaeology cannot recover the exact thoughts behind a fuel pile or prove that one failed hearth directly changed a group's behavior. It can, however, show repeated hearth use, recurring occupation, organized activity around fire, and long traditions of working with fuel, ash, heat, and shelter. These patterns suggest that fire management was not a single discovery made once. It was a body of knowledge renewed through use. Each night tested that knowledge again. A group that survived a failed fire could learn which materials lasted, which ones smoked, where cold entered, and how quickly the shelter cooled without flame. The lesson could be carried without formal teaching. A younger person might watch where an older person stored tinder. Someone might begin gathering thicker fuel before sunset. A child might learn not to disturb the ash covering a bed of embers. A different sleeper might be placed closer to the fire because they had awakened first during the previous failure. Knowledge moved through observation, repetition, correction, and shared memory. The night when the fire went out before dawn therefore mattered not only because of the danger it created, it exposed the hidden work that every successful fire required. Warmth at midnight depended on fuel collected earlier. Safety before sunrise depended on attention preserved through fatigue. Recovery depended on tools, tinder, bodies, and decisions already in place. Fire was never simply possessed. It had to be maintained across time, and the people who depended on it had to organize themselves around that demand. The lasting lesson was not that a skilled group could prevent every failure. It was that survival often depended on recognizing that even the most familiar source of safety could disappear if preparation ended too soon, before the sky began to brighten over the winter landscape. The survival of the group did not depend on one exceptional person standing alone beside the hearth. Fire demanded too many kinds of work for that. Someone had to gather fuel before dark. Someone had to recognize which pieces were dry, which would burn quickly, and which should be saved for later. Someone had to keep bedding far enough from sparks, watch the direction of smoke, notice when the wind changed, and remember where tools and tinder had been placed. During the night, another person might wake first, another might hear the fire become quiet, and another might have the steadiest hands for rebuilding a weak ember. No single body could perform every task at every moment. The strength of the group lay in spreading knowledge and responsibility across several people, so that the failure of one action did not become the failure of the whole camp. This did not require a formal system, with fixed titles or spoken rules that archaeology could recover. It could exist through habit. One person gathered branches while returning from another task. Another placed fine tinder beneath a covering to keep it dry. Someone near the entrance adjusted a hide when the wind shifted. A child learned which materials were not to be disturbed. An older person recognized from the smell of smoke that damp fuel had been added. These actions were small enough to disappear from the archaeological record, yet together they formed the practical structure that kept a hearth alive. Shared knowledge was especially important because conditions changed. A fuel that worked well in one landscape might be scarce in another. A shelter that held heat during calm weather could become smoky when the wind turned. A method learned from an older generation had to be adjusted to new materials, new seasons, and new camps. Knowledge, therefore, survived not by remaining fixed, but by being tested and corrected. A failed fire revealed where the old pattern was no longer enough. The group could then redistribute tasks, move the fuel reserve, prepare different tinder, or change who slept closest to the hearth. Cooperation also protected knowledge from the limits of individual bodies. The person most skilled at tending embers could become injured, exhausted, or too cold to work. If others had watched and practiced, the skill remained available. A younger member might not yet possess the same judgment, but could prepare twigs, shield tinder from wind, or learn to recognize the color of a living coal. A person with less physical strength could still remember where dry fuel was stored or notice that a covering had opened near the entrance. Survival did not divide neatly between strong and weak. It depended on different abilities becoming useful at different moments. The night when the fire went out made this dependence visible. The people who stayed beneath the hides preserved warmth for the group. The person at the hearth protected the final ember. The one near the entrance managed the draft. The one returning with fuel carried energy back into the shelter. Someone watching a child prevented a second danger from developing while others focused on the first. None of these tasks appeared heroic, and most lasted only a few minutes, yet the fire could return only because they were connected. This was one of the quiet foundations of human survival in cold environments. Knowledge became more reliable when it was shared, and labor became safer when it was divided. A group did not overcome winter by eliminating uncertainty. It survived by noticing small failures early, passing information quickly, and allowing many ordinary actions to support one another. The fire at the center of the shelter was visible, but the network of attention that sustained it was not. When the flame failed, that invisible network became the group's remaining source of order. Its value became clearest when warmth and light could no longer help them. What happened when an Ice Age fire went out before dawn cannot be reduced to one universal outcome. In one shelter, a buried ember may have survived and returned to flame within minutes. In another, the group may have endured the remaining darkness beneath hides and shared body warmth until daylight made fuel gathering safer. Elsewhere, poor weather, damp materials, illness, injury, or distance from fuel may have made the same event far more dangerous. Archaeology cannot identify every lost fire or recover the exact decisions made beside it. What it can show is that prehistoric people repeatedly built hearths, organized activity around them, used shelters, prepared materials, and lived through environments in which warmth could never be taken for granted. The most honest answer is therefore not a single scene, but a range of human responses shaped by place, season, technology, knowledge, and cooperation. The fire going out did not automatically mean death, just as the presence of fire did not guarantee safety. It meant that one important layer of protection had failed, forcing the group to depend more heavily on every other layer still available. Bedding mattered. Shelter shape mattered. Dry tinder mattered. The ability to read wind, ash, smoke, and bodily signs mattered. Most of all, the actions of other people mattered. This is the educational value carried by such a quiet event. Human survival was rarely the result of one invention working perfectly forever. It was the result of systems that could fail without destroying everything at once. When the hearth failed, bodies still shared warmth. When darkness reduced vision, memory still mapped the shelter. When one person became too cold to work, another could take over. When a method failed, the experience could alter the next night's preparation. Resilience did not mean that prehistoric people were immune to cold, fear, error, or loss. It meant that knowledge, materials, and responsibility could be arranged so that one failure did not immediately become the end of the group. This remains an important lesson when we think about the long human past. It is tempting to imagine survival as a story of stronger bodies, greater courage, or a sudden brilliant discovery. Yet much of survival may have depended on quieter abilities, noticing a weak ember, keeping grass dry, moving a child away from a draft, storing one dense branch for later, or remembering which person knew how to begin again. These actions were small, but their value increased when conditions became difficult. A successful fire left warmth. A failed fire may have left knowledge. That knowledge could pass through demonstration, correction, and memory rather than through written instruction. The next generation did not need to know every detail of the night when the flame disappeared. It only needed to inherit better habits because someone had survived it, remembered what failed, and quietly changed how the following fire was prepared. We should also resist turning this into a comforting promise that humans always adapted successfully. Many dangers of Ice Age life could not be solved, and many individuals and groups undoubtedly suffered or died from exposure, injury, hunger, and weather. Adaptability improved chances. It did not remove vulnerability. That is why the extinguished hearth is so revealing. It places human strength and human fragility in the same small space. The group could think, cooperate, and learn, yet it still depended on dry fuel, functioning bodies, and a little heat hidden under ash. By sunrise, the shelter might again contain flame, or it might remain cold while the people prepared to move. Either way, the night would have changed what they understood about fire. Perhaps the habits that kept human beings alive were not learned from the fires that burned perfectly through the night, but from the ones that failed. So how much of human survival began in the darkness left behind by a dying flame?